Imagine being at 25,000 feet, the air frigid and thin. You squint through your gun sight, dozens of machine gun barrels aimed directly at you. It's January 27, 1943, and the morning air over Germany hung thick with contrails. Inside the cramped cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, a seasoned pilot flying combat missions since Spain in 1936, was ready. He'd faced RAF Hurricanes, Soviet Yaks, and American P-40 Warhawks. He knew how bombers died: a good burst from 400 yards, 20mm shells tearing through aluminum skin, engines catching fire, wings folding. But today, something was different. What about this approaching formation challenged everything he knew? 58 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses were making their way toward Wilhelmshaven in the first American daylight bombing raid against Germany proper. The Luftwaffe pilots had heard rumors about these flying fortresses, as the Americans called them, but rumors were cheap. Philipp had shot down 93 enemy aircraft. He knew his business. He pushed the throttle forward, angling for a tail attack. Standard procedure. The bomber formation grew larger in his windscreen. Then he saw them, machine gun barrels, dozens of them, protruding from every angle of every aircraft. The mid-morning sun glinted off polished metal and plexiglass turrets that swiveled to track his approach. Philipp pressed his firing button. His cannons roared. Shell casings tumbled past his canopy. He watched his rounds strike home, flashes of impact along the bomber's fuselage. The fortress shuddered. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away, but it kept flying. He fired again. More hits. The bomber's return fire intensified, tracers arcing toward him in streams of red and orange. He broke away hard, pulling 6 Gs, his vision tunneling. When he leveled out and looked back, the formation was unchanged, solid, unbroken. What did this unprecedented resilience mean for the future of the air war? The initial encounters with American heavy bombers sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. By the time German intelligence officers compiled their first comprehensive assessment of the B-17 in February 1943, they had learned an uncomfortable truth. American heavy bombers absorbed punishment that would have obliterated any aircraft they'd previously encountered. A single raid might see dozens of German fighters empty their ammunition into the formations, scoring hundreds of hits, and still, most of the fortresses made it home. The mathematics were brutal, and the answer kept pointing towards something the Germans hadn't fully appreciated. What hidden power enabled these fortresses to withstand such relentless assault? The mystery began to unravel when they captured their first intact specimens and pried open the ammunition containers in the waist gun positions. Inside those metal cans lay rounds, unlike anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. The cartridge was massive, nearly 6 inches long, topped with a bullet half an inch in diameter. The brass casing gleamed dully in the winter light. German ordnance specialists measured it, weighed it, and subjected it to ballistic testing. What they discovered explained everything: why American gunners could reach out and touch German fighters at distances that seemed impossible, why tracer rounds from the bombers appeared to maintain their velocity for so long, why pilots reported that even glancing hits from these weapons could tear control surfaces apart or punch through armored windscreens. The Americans had brought the .50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge to the European theater. This round, originally conceived during the First World War to defeat armored targets and aircraft, had been refined over 2 decades into something approaching perfection. The specifications told a story of industrial ambition: muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second, muzzle energy exceeding 12,000 foot-pounds. For comparison, the standard German 7.92mm machine gun round, the backbone of Luftwaffe fighter armament, generated roughly 2,800 foot-pounds of energy. The American defensive round hit 4 times harder, but raw power was only part of the equation. What other factors made this ammunition so devastatingly effective? The Germans discovered that American ammunition came in carefully orchestrated combinations. Every 5th round was a tracer, red-hot magnesium burning bright enough to track across miles of sky. Between the tracers came armor-piercing rounds with hardened steel cores, armor-piercing incendiary rounds that burst into flame on impact, and standard ball ammunition. The mixing ratio was deliberate: calculated to provide visual feedback for gunners while maximizing destructive effect. When a gunner squeezed his trigger, he was firing a stream of projectiles designed to punch through metal, ignite fuel, and demonstrate exactly where his bullets were going. Why did this seemingly simple combination prove so strategically powerful? The effective range was what truly disturbed German tactical planners. Luftwaffe doctrine had evolved around the assumption that bomber defensive armament was effective to perhaps 400 yards under ideal conditions. German fighter pilots trained to attack from 600 yards, outside the danger zone, or so they believed. The 50 caliber Browning had an effective air-to-air range of approximately 700 yards. American gunners could begin engaging targets before German pilots expected to face return fire. That margin of 200 yards, roughly 6 football fields, represented the difference between attacking with impunity and flying into a wall of lead. German engineers examining captured B-17s in early 1943 found themselves confronting an aircraft that embodied a fundamentally different philosophy of aerial warfare. How did this philosophical divergence escalate the conflict? Where Luftwaffe bombers like the Heinkel, He-111 or Junkers Ju-88 carried perhaps 3 to 5 machine guns for self-defense, the early B-17C model arrived in combat with 4.50 caliber machine guns and 1.30 caliber gun in the nose. Inadequate certainly, but the trajectory was clear. American doctrine called for layered, overlapping fields of defensive fire. By late 1942, field modifications were adding nose guns. By spring 1943, the B-17F model featured up to 11 50 caliber positions. And by summer, the B-17G bristled with 13 guns distributed across 9 positions. 13 guns per aircraft meant 13 streams of half-inch projectiles, each weapon capable of firing 750 rounds per minute. A single bomber at full defensive output could theoretically release over 9,000 rounds per minute into the surrounding airspace. What happened when these solitary giants started flying together? But American bombers didn't fly alone. They flew in formations, combat boxes designed by Colonel Curtis LeMay and other tacticians to create overlapping fields of fire. A typical group formation might field 18 to 21 aircraft. That meant somewhere between 234 and 273 heavy machine guns pointing outward from a single bomber group. When multiple groups formed wing formations, the numbers climbed into the hundreds of guns. Luftwaffe pilots coined a term for these formations: Fliegende Stachelschweine, flying porcupines. It was an apt description. Approaching a combat box from any angle meant facing dozens of gun barrels tracking your movement, dozens of gunners calculating deflection, dozens of triggers waiting to be pulled. The psychological effect was profound. What was it like to face such an overwhelming aerial defense? Many Luftwaffe veterans, men who'd faced Soviet anti-aircraft fire over Stalingrad or dodged RAF night fighters over the Channel, described attacking B-17 formations as the most nerve-wracking combat they experienced. Not because of accuracy. Bomber gunnery was notoriously difficult, hampered by cold, altitude, and the need to lead fast-moving targets, but because of volume, sheer, overwhelming volume. The ammunition expenditure figures told the story of American industrial capacity. A single 8th Air Force mission in 1943 might involve 300 bombers. If each bomber carried 7,500 rounds, a typical load for the B-17G, that single mission represented over 2 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition in the sky simultaneously. The St. Louis ammunition plant alone produced 6.7 billion rounds of 30 caliber and 50 caliber ammunition during the war. In April 1945, shortly before Germany's surrender, the Army Air Forces in the European and Mediterranean theaters fired nearly 25 million rounds of machine gun and cannon ammunition in a single month, the vast majority 50 caliber. What did these numbers mean for Germany's defense? German quartermasters could calculate the implications. The Luftwaffe's entire fighter force in the West numbered roughly 800 aircraft by mid-1943. American bomber formations were bringing more machine guns to a single raid than the Luftwaffe had fighters to oppose them. And those machine guns were fed by supply chains that seemed limitless: ships crossing the Atlantic, trains rolling across England, trucks delivering to airfields, armorers loading fresh belts before every mission. The ammunition never stopped coming. But the story of the .50 caliber wasn't simply about overwhelming force. It was about the choices that overwhelming force imposed on German fighter tactics and the deadly calculus those choices created. What tactical shifts did the Germans attempt to make? In late 1942, when the first sustained American daylight bombing campaign began, Luftwaffe fighter pilots initially approached B-17 formations using tactics proven against RAF bombers. The standard attack profile called for positioning 600 yards behind and slightly above the target, diving to attack speed, opening fire with 20mm cannons and machine guns at 400 to 500 yards, then breaking away at 150 yards to avoid collision. Against Wellington or Sterling bombers flying at night, this worked. Against Halifax bombers with their modest defensive armament, this worked. Against B-17s in daylight, this got pilots killed. How did the raw numbers expose the flaws in their established tactics? The mathematics of the engagement were unforgiving. A Focke-Wulf FW-190 carried approximately 500 rounds for its cannons, enough for roughly 12 seconds of continuous fire at the cyclic rate, but nobody fired continuously. Effective gunnery required controlled bursts of 1 to 2 seconds. A skilled pilot might get 6 to 8 firing opportunities before his ammunition was exhausted. German after-action analysis indicated that approximately 20 hits from 20mm high explosive rounds were needed to ensure destruction of a B-17 when attacking from the rear. The average Luftwaffe pilot achieved a hit rate of roughly 2%. That meant firing approximately 1,000 rounds to guarantee 20 hits. A single FW-190 carried half that ammunition. The implications were stark. Unless a German pilot achieved exceptional accuracy, 3 to 4% hit rates, twice the average, he would exhaust his ammunition before destroying a single bomber. And all of this assumed he survived the approach, the attack, and the escape. Why was every second within range a terrifying gamble? Every second spent within 700 yards of the formation meant exposure to defensive fire. Every second spent tracking a target meant flying predictably. Every second spent lining up a shot meant not evading. The .50 caliber rounds didn't need to hit pilots directly to be effective. They could shatter canopies, sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, damage engines, and destroy instruments. A single armor-piercing incendiary round striking a wing root could ignite fuel vapor and turn a fighter into a fireball. The armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the armored glass of a fighter's windscreen at ranges exceeding 400 yards. German pilots learned to fear not direct hits but the accumulation of minor damage, a hydraulic line severed here, an aileron control damaged there, that would leave them limping home or force landing in a field with a fighter too damaged to repair. By November 1942, Luftwaffe combat units were reporting that conventional stern attacks against B-17 formations produced unacceptable loss rates. For every bomber destroyed, the Germans were losing one or more fighters, and fighters were far harder to replace than bombers. How did Germany's strained industrial capacity exacerbate this problem? Germany's industrial capacity was already strained. Pilot training took months. The Eastern Front consumed aircraft and pilots at a horrific rate. Every fighter lost over Germany was a fighter that couldn't be deployed against Soviet bombers or British night raiders. So German tacticians evolved. If attacking from behind meant flying through the heaviest defensive fire for the longest time, then attacking from ahead offered advantages. The nose of the early B-17F model was its weakest point, protected initially by just a single .30 caliber machine gun in the plexiglass nose compartment, later upgraded to twin .50 caliber guns in flexible mounts, but still offering less defensive firepower than the tail, waist, or dorsal turret positions. What made a head-on attack so appealing despite its inherent dangers? A head-on attack minimized exposure time. At a closing speed of 600 mph, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 at full attack speed approaching a B-17, cruising at 200 mph. The German pilot would be within firing range for only seconds. But those seconds offered a clear shot at the cockpit, the bombardier's position, the instrument panel, all vital areas where a few hits could mission kill an aircraft, even if they didn't destroy it outright. The tactic was first systematically employed by Major Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II in late 1942. Meyer, a veteran pilot with over 60 victories, recognized that head-on attacks required different skills than traditional fighter combat. There was no time for sustained fire, no opportunity for correction. The pilot had to estimate range, lead the target, fire a concentrated burst, and break away all within 3 to 4 seconds. How did this split-second combat challenge human perception? The closure rate was so high that depth perception became almost useless. Pilots had to rely on practiced judgment, firing from what felt like suicidal range, often 300 yards or less, trusting that their rounds would connect before the collision. It took exceptional courage. Lesser pilots would fire too early from too far away, wasting ammunition on empty sky, or they'd hesitate, breaking off before their rounds had time to strike home. The best pilots learned to hold steady until they could see the individual window panels on the bomber's nose, until they could distinguish the bombardier's face behind the plexiglass, until every instinct screamed at them to pull away. Only then would they fire a 3-second burst that emptied half their ammunition, and then yank back on the stick, pulling up and over the bomber with perhaps 50 feet of clearance, wingtip to wingtip, close enough to see the American gunners tracking them with their weapons. What made these successful head-on passes so devastatingly effective? When the technique worked, it was devastatingly effective. 20mm high explosive shells entering through the nose would detonate inside the cockpit or forward compartment. The confined space amplified the blast effect. Pilots and bombardiers died instantly. Even near misses could be catastrophic. A shell striking the plexiglass would send fragments of glass and metal through the forward compartment like shrapnel. The sudden loss of cabin pressure at 25,000 feet would incapacitate anyone not properly protected, and, critically, a B-17 with its pilot dead or wounded and its flight controls damaged would fall out of formation. Once a bomber left the protection of the group, it became vulnerable to follow-up attacks from any angle. By December 1942, head-on attacks had become standard Luftwaffe doctrine against American day bombers. German fighter groups practiced the technique obsessively, running mock attacks against captured B-17s to calibrate the timing and develop the instinctive judgment needed for such split-second engagements. How were the Americans preparing their own counter-response? Training films showed the correct approach angles, the optimal firing points, the escape maneuvers that minimized exposure to defensive fire. The Luftwaffe was adapting, learning, evolving its tactics to counter the American strategic bombing offensive, but the Americans were evolving too. By January 1943, 8th Air Force bomber crews had identified the head-on attack as their most dangerous threat. Mission reports detailed fighters boring in from 12 o'clock high, cannons flashing before screaming past with mere feet of separation. Loss rates among lead squadrons which bore the brunt of frontal attacks climbed steadily. Something had to change. What was their solution to this deadly new threat? The solution emerged from both official modification programs and unofficial field improvisation. Bomber groups began installing additional 50 caliber machine guns in the nose compartment, positioning them in flexible mounts that allowed the bombardier or navigator to engage targets ahead of the aircraft. The installations were crude at first, manually aimed weapons that required the operator to brace himself against the aircraft structure and fight the slipstream, but they provided forward-firing capability that hadn't existed before. A fighter pilot approaching from ahead now faced not one .30 caliber pop gun, but two 50 caliber heavy machine guns capable of reaching out 700 yards. How did this grassroots effort transform into a widespread defense? The modifications spread through the 8th Air Force during early 1943, but the process was slow. Aircraft could only be modified when they weren't flying combat missions, and by spring 1943 the tempo of operations left little downtime. Groups improvised with whatever materials and expertise were available. Some installations were elegant, using standardized mounting hardware and ammunition feeds. Others were cobbled together from scrap metal and salvaged parts, but all of them shared a common purpose, filling the defensive gap that German pilots had learned to exploit. The official solution arrived in May. 1943, when the first factory-equipped B-17F models with nose gun mountings reached England, followed soon after by the B-17G model featuring the Bendix Chin turret, a powered, remotely aimed turret mounting two 50 caliber guns beneath the nose. How did this technological leap redefine the bomber's frontal defense? The Chin turret was operated by the bombardier using a computing sight that automatically calculated lead angles. It could traverse 160 degrees horizontally and 80 degrees vertically, covering virtually the entire forward hemisphere. More importantly, it allowed concentrated fire where flexible nose guns required the bombardier to manually track and lead a target while fighting wind, blast, and cold. The Chin turret brought the same level of automation that dorsal and ball turrets had provided for other defensive positions. The impact on German tactics was immediate. Head-on attacks became vastly more dangerous. A fighter approaching from 12 o'clock now faced fire not just from nose guns, but from the top turret, which could depress slightly forward, and from any other gunner with a forward angle of fire. At those ranges, even relatively inexperienced gunners could achieve hits. How did the very advantage of head-on attacks now become their greatest weakness? The closure rate that had been the head-on attack's greatest advantage now became a liability. There was no time to evade, no opportunity to bank left or right. The fighter pilot was committed to a straight-line approach into concentrated fire. Luftwaffe loss rates in frontal attacks climbed through summer 1943. The tactics still worked, skilled pilots still achieved kills, but the cost exchange ratio shifted. For every bomber destroyed in a head-on pass, the Luftwaffe was losing fighters at unsustainable rates. And unlike the Americans, who could replace losses through massive industrial production and transatlantic logistics, the Germans were already operating on the edge. Every pilot lost represented months of training that couldn't be recovered. Every aircraft destroyed represented production capacity diverted from other fronts. The tactical evolution continued on both sides, move and counter-move. What new weapons and strategies did the Germans introduce? As the air war over Europe intensified through 1943, the Germans introduced new weapons, 30mm cannons that could destroy a bomber with 2 or 3 hits, 21mm rockets designed to break up formations from outside machine gun range, upward-firing cannon installations that allowed fighters to attack from directly below, where defensive fire was weakest. The Americans responded with tighter formations, improved armor, better training, and always more guns and more ammunition. But beneath the tactical back and forth lay a fundamental asymmetry that German intelligence officers understood, even if they couldn't overcome it. The Americans were fighting a war of industrial attrition that Germany couldn't win. What critical operations revealed the brutal truth of this attrition? Every 50 caliber round represented steel, brass, powder, and primers produced by factories that bombed continuously, transported by ships that crossed the Atlantic in vast convoys, distributed by logistics networks that functioned with relentless efficiency. The ammunition was unlimited because the industrial base producing it was effectively unlimited. Germany, blockaded and bombed, fighting on multiple fronts, could not match that production. The Luftwaffe could innovate tactically, it could develop new weapons, it could train exceptional pilots, but it couldn't change the fundamental arithmetic of attrition. This reality would crystallize in the late summer and fall of 1943, when the Americans launched their most ambitious and costliest deep penetration raids into the heart of the Reich. The Butcher's Bill for these missions would demonstrate both the strengths and limitations of defensive armament in strategic bombing and force both sides to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of air warfare. What were the targets for this pivotal mission? The date was August 17, 1943. The targets were Regensburg and Schweinfurt, 2 cities deep in southern Germany, well beyond the range of any fighter escort available to the Americans. Regensburg housed Messerschmitt production facilities. Schweinfurt contained nearly half of Germany's ball-bearing manufacturing capacity. Both were strategic targets whose destruction could cripple German war production. Both were defended by concentrated flak batteries and positioned to allow Luftwaffe fighters maximum time to intercept before and after the bombing run. The plan called for a double strike. 146 B-17s would attack Regensburg, then continue south over the Alps to land at bases in North Africa, a shuttle bombing mission designed to complicate German defensive planning. 230 B-17s would strike Schweinfurt and return to England. The two forces would fly together for the initial penetration, splitting south of Frankfurt, presenting the Luftwaffe with multiple threats to defend simultaneously. What critical miscalculation immediately undermined this intricate plan? At least, that was the plan. Dawn on August 17th found the airfields of eastern England covered with thick clouds. The weather forecast had predicted clearing, but the clearing didn't come. The Regensburg force managed to take off and form up, climbing through gaps in the clouds. The Schweinfurt force was delayed, first by 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2 hours, as pilots waited for visibility that would allow safe formation assembly. The coordination that was supposed to split German defensive attention evaporated. The Luftwaffe would face two separate raids, one after the other, with hours to rearm and refuel between them. How did the First Force fare in this lopsided battle? The Regensburg force crossed into Germany shortly after 9 in the morning. P-47 Thunderbolt escort fighters accompanied them to the German border, the absolute limit of the Thunderbolt's range, then turned back, their fuel exhausted. The bombers continued alone. Jagdgeschwader 26 was waiting. The first attacks came as waves of Focke-Wulf FW-190s diving from high altitude, two-plane elements, executing head-on passes at 500 mph closing speeds. The lead squadron took the brunt. Within minutes, B-17s were falling, one with engines smoking, another trailing fuel, a third breaking apart as a direct hit from a rocket detonated in its bomb bay. The formations tightened, pilots flying closer together to maintain the overlapping defensive fields of fire that were their only protection. Gunners tracked targets, squeezed triggers, watched tracer rounds arc out toward attackers that appeared and vanished in seconds. What was the human cost of this relentless aerial combat? The battle continued for over an hour as the bombers pushed deeper into Germany. Fighters attacked from every angle, head-on from the sides, from below using upward-firing cannons, from above in near-vertical dives. Some attacks were coordinated, multiple fighters converging on single bombers from different vectors. Others were solo pilots making repeated passes, exhausting their ammunition, landing at forward fields to rearm, then returning for another sortie. The ammunition expenditure on both sides was enormous. B-17 gunners burned through thousands of rounds, barrels overheating despite the frigid air at altitude. German pilots emptied their cannons, dove away, refueled, and rearmed in as little as 10 minutes, then returned to the battle. By the time the Regensburg force reached its target and dropped its bombs, 24 B-17s had been shot down. Another dozen struggled with battle damage, wounded crew, failed engines, shredded control surfaces. The formation turned south, crossing the Alps. German fighters harassed them until they finally passed beyond reach. They landed in North Africa, counting losses, treating wounded, assessing damage. 3 more bombers were written off as too damaged to repair. What awaited the second, delayed force? The Schweinfurt force had it worse. Delayed for hours, they crossed into Germany in the early afternoon with no possibility of splitting Luftwaffe attention. Every fighter that had engaged the Regensburg mission had time to rearm and reposition. The Germans knew the target. It had to be Schweinfurt or another industrial center, and concentrated their forces accordingly. 230 B-17s faced the full weight of the Western Luftwaffe's fighter force. The attacks were systematic and brutal. Fighter formations positioned themselves ahead of the bomber stream, allowing the fortresses to approach, then executed coordinated assault waves. Head-on attacks by Messerschmitt Bf-109s created gaps in the formation. Follow-up attacks by heavily armed Focke-Wulf FW-190s exploited those gaps, concentrating fire on isolated bombers. Twin-engine Messerschmitt Me-110 Zesturas, bomber destroyers, equipped with heavy cannons, made high-speed passes from the flanks. How effective was the B-17's defense against this onslaught? The defensive firepower of the B-17 formations took its toll. German fighters fell, some in flames, others trailing smoke, a few breaking apart under accumulated damage from dozens of hits. But the Luftwaffe had depth. Replacement fighters kept coming. 36 B-17s were shot down. Dozens more limped home with severe damage. The combined loss for both missions, 60 B-17s destroyed, 12 more written off. Hundreds of airmen killed, wounded, or captured. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 38 fighters, a favorable kill ratio from the German perspective. Though the loss of experienced pilots hurt more than the loss of aircraft, both sides claimed victory. The Americans had struck deep into Germany and hit their targets. The Germans had inflicted unsustainable losses that would force a pause in deep penetration daylight raids. Both sides were right, and both faced uncomfortable questions about their strategies going forward. What grim nickname would the autumn of 1943 acquire? The autumn of 1943 brought what bomber crews began calling the Bloody Fall. The August raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt had demonstrated that unescorted heavy bombers, despite their formidable defensive armament, could not indefinitely sustain deep penetration missions against determined fighter opposition. The mathematics were inescapable. Even if every gunner performed perfectly, even if every .50 caliber round found its mark, the Luftwaffe could trade fighters for bombers at rates that ultimately favored the defense. Germany was fighting on interior lines, able to concentrate forces at predicted targets. The bombers had to fly predictable routes dictated by fuel capacity, weather, and target selection. And most critically, the bombers flew during daylight when Luftwaffe fighters could vector onto formations with visual precision. Yet the strategic imperative demanded continuation of the bombing campaign. American doctrine held that precision daylight bombing could destroy Germany's industrial capacity and break its will to fight without requiring a costly ground invasion. The theory was elegant. The execution was proving extraordinarily expensive. How costly did these subsequent missions become? September 6, 1943, target Stuttgart, at the extreme limit of B-17 range in mid-1943. 400 bombers launched. German fighters intercepted over France and maintained contact all the way to the target and back. The attacks were relentless, wave after wave, hour after hour. 45 bombers failed to return. The loss rate exceeded 10%. At that rate of attrition, a crew's statistical chance of surviving their required 25-mission tour approached zero. October 8th, target Bremen, known to crews as Flak City for its concentrated anti-aircraft defenses. The combination of heavy flak over the target and sustained fighter attacks along the route cost 30 bombers. October 10th, Münster. The 100th Bomb Group, later known as the Bloody 100th for its catastrophic loss rates, lost 12 of 13 aircraft on a single mission. Only one B-17 returned to base. The group effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit until replacements could be brought up. What new German tactics emerged from these crushing victories? The tactical evolution continued. German fighter units had learned that the key to breaking bomber formations was concentration. Instead of attacking individually or in small groups, entire Jagdgeschwaders would mass their strength, sometimes 40 or 50 fighters, and execute coordinated assault waves against a single bomber group. The goal was not simply to destroy bombers, but to scatter the formation. Once a combat box broke apart, individual bombers became vulnerable to follow-up attacks from any angle. The overlapping fields of fire that provided mutual protection disappeared. What followed was a turkey shoot. The Luftwaffe also refined the bomber-destroyer concept. Specialized Focke-Wulf FW-190 variants designated Sturmbock or Ramjäger were armored to withstand defensive fire and armed with additional cannons. Some carried 4 30mm cannons capable of destroying a bomber with a single burst. Others were equipped with 21 Simitins rockets, unguided missiles with 40 LB warheads launched from tubes beneath the wings. The rockets were inaccurate but devastating. A direct hit would vaporize a bomber instantly. A near miss could inflict enough damage to force the aircraft out of formation, making it vulnerable to follow-up attacks. How did these desperate measures impact the pilots themselves? The Sturmbock pilots were volunteers, selected for aggressiveness and skill, organized into dedicated units whose sole mission was to press attacks to point-blank range, regardless of defensive fire. The tactic was effective but costly. Sturmbock pilots had life expectancies measured in single-digit missions. They accepted the risk because they understood what was at stake. Their country was being systematically destroyed from the air, and only their sacrifice could slow the onslaught. Against this evolved threat, the 1350 caliber guns on each B-17 represented formidable defensive capability, but not invincibility. How did these weapons perform under the most extreme conditions? The weapons themselves functioned superbly under conditions that would have disabled lesser designs. At 25,000 feet, where the bombers cruised, the temperature routinely dropped to 40 below zero Fahrenheit. The air was so thin that crews required supplemental oxygen continuously. Exposed metal froze on contact. Human skin could freeze in seconds. In this environment, the Browning M250 caliber kept firing. The weapon's reliability was legendary. Wartime studies found that stoppages averaged 1 per 4,000 rounds fired, and most malfunctions traced to faulty ammunition or improperly adjusted headspace, the critical gap between the bolt face and the barrel when locked. Armorers could adjust headspace in minutes with the proper gauges. The ammunition feeding system, disintegrating metallic links that held individual rounds in belts, proved remarkably resistant to jamming even when frozen. Each gun had an electric heating element wrapped around the barrel jacket to prevent ice accumulation and maintain operating temperature. The heaters drew 24 volts from the aircraft's electrical system and could keep a barrel warm enough to function even during hour-long missions at extreme altitude. But reliability meant nothing if the gunners couldn't effectively engage targets. What challenges did bomber gunnery present? Gunnery from a bomber in formation presented challenges unlike any other form of aerial combat. Fighter pilots aimed their guns by aiming their entire aircraft, pointing the nose at the target and firing forward-mounted weapons. Bomber gunners had to account for their own aircraft speed, the target speed, the convergence angle, wind drift, and the ballistic drop of their rounds. The computing gun sights mounted in powered turrets helped by automatically calculating deflection angles based on range and target motion. But the gunners in flexible positions, waist guns, nose guns, relied on manual aiming using ring and post sights or simple reticles. Effective gunnery required instinct developed through hundreds of hours of practice. The training never fully prepared crews for the reality. What was it like to face an attacking fighter for the first time? The first time a fighter came at you, boring in with guns flashing, the instinct was to flinch. The closing speed was so great that the fighter appeared as a .1 moment and filled your entire field of vision the next. The temptation was to open fire too early, wasting ammunition on a target still outside effective range, or to hold too long and miss the narrow window when rounds could connect. Combat veterans learned to control the fear response, to wait for the target to enter the kill zone, 400 to 600 yards. Then fire controlled bursts of 3 to 5 seconds, tracking the target's movement, watching for hits. The tracer rounds helped. Every fifth round burned bright red, creating visible streams that showed where your fire was going. Experienced gunners learned to walk their traces onto target, making minute corrections until the streams of fire converged on the fighter. How did the staggering rate of ammunition expenditure create a cruel dilemma for gunners? The expenditure of ammunition during sustained combat was staggering. A B-17G carried approximately 7,500 rounds distributed across its 13 gun positions. The waist guns received the largest allocation, 200 rounds each, because they covered the broadest arc and typically faced the heaviest combat. The tail guns had 565 rounds each. The chin turret carried 1,460 rounds. These numbers sounded substantial until you calculated firing time. At a cyclic rate of 750 rounds per minute, a single gun could exhaust its ammunition in roughly 90 seconds of continuous fire. Nobody fired continuously. Barrel heating and accuracy concerns demanded burst fire, but during intense combat phases when fighters pressed attacks from multiple vectors simultaneously, gunners could burn through their entire ammunition supply in 20 to 30 minutes. This created a cruel dilemma. Conservative fire discipline preserved ammunition but allowed more German fighters to press attacks unmolested, increasing damage to the formation. Aggressive fire discipline might drive off attackers but left guns empty when the next wave arrived. The solution was communication and fire coordination. The pilot or aircraft commander would announce threats over the intercom. Fighters at 9 o'clock level, or Bandits 12 o'clock high, allowing gunners to prioritize threats and avoid multiple gunners firing at the same target while others went unengaged. The best crews developed an almost telepathic coordination, each gunner understanding his sector of responsibility, trusting his crewmates to cover their assigned zones. What were the extraordinary physical and psychological tolls on these men? The physical demands on gunners were extraordinary. The waist gunners stood for hours at their positions, exposed to wind blast from the open gun windows, bracing against the aircraft's movements, absorbing the recoil of weapons, firing inches from their bodies. They wore multiple layers of electrically heated clothing beneath leather flying suits, but the cold still penetrated. Frostbite was common, so was hypoxia, oxygen starvation caused by faulty equipment or damaged oxygen lines. A gunner suffering hypoxia might continue appearing to function while losing judgment and coordination, unable to recognize his own impairment until he collapsed. Crew discipline demanded that everyone continuously monitored everyone else for signs of hypoxia, slurred speech, erratic behavior, failure to respond to radio calls. What was it like inside the most confined position? The ball turret. The ball turret gunner had the most claustrophobic position. The Sperry ball turret was a sphere roughly 4 feet in diameter that hung beneath the bomber's fuselage, retracting partially into the aircraft during takeoff and landing. Inside this sphere, the gunner crouched in a fetal position with his knees drawn up, surrounded by machinery and ammunition. Two 50 caliber guns pointed downward and forward, controlled by a computing sight and hand controls that rotated the entire turret 360 degrees. The position offered unparalleled fields of fire below and to the sides of the aircraft, critical for defending against attacks from the lower hemisphere. But it was a coffin if the turret's electrical system failed, or if the aircraft had to make an emergency crash landing with insufficient time to retract the turret and extract the gunner. Ball turret gunners were typically the smallest members of the crew, selected for their ability to fit into the confined space. They trained extensively on emergency egress procedures, learning to disconnect their oxygen, electrical, and communication lines, rotate the turret to the access position, and squeeze through the access hatch into the aircraft interior in under 30 seconds. In combat, with battle damage disabling electrical systems, some ball turret gunners found themselves trapped in their spheres, unable to rotate to the egress position, forced to ride down in crash landings or bail out in their turrets. The survival rate for trapped ball turret gunners was effectively zero. What about the tail gunner, the last line of defense? The tail gunner occupied the loneliest position, separated from the rest of the crew by the length of the fuselage accessed through a narrow crawl space barely large enough to squeeze through. The tail gunner sat backward in a cramped compartment, knees bent, operating twin 50 caliber guns that covered the rear approach. This was traditionally the most dangerous position because German fighters initially favored stern attacks. The tail gunner was the last line of defense, the man who had to remain calm and accurate while watching fighters grow larger in his sight, knowing that if he missed or malfunctioned, those fighters would hammer his aircraft with cannon fire. Some tail gunners recorded confirmed kills in double digits, aerial victories that would have made them aces had they been flying fighters. Most never knew whether their fire destroyed, damaged, or simply scared off attackers. They kept firing, kept tracking, kept their sector clear. Who else contributed to the bomber's formidable defense? The top turret gunner, also the flight engineer, operated from a powered turret mounted above the fuselage behind the cockpit. His position offered excellent visibility and coverage of the upper hemisphere, making it critical for engaging fighters diving from high altitude. The top turret also served as a backup command position. If the pilot and co-pilot were incapacitated, the flight engineer had controls that allowed him to maintain level flight, not landing capability, but enough to keep the aircraft stable, while other crew members rendered first aid or prepared for bailout. Many aircraft returned home with dead or wounded pilots, kept aloft by flight engineers who held formation for hours until reaching friendly territory. The radio operator manned a single flexible 50 caliber gun that fired upward from a position behind the bomb bay. His primary duty was communication, monitoring frequencies, relaying commands, handling emergencies. But when fighters attacked, he became another gunner, adding to the defensive firepower. The same was true for the navigator and bombardier who manned the nose guns when not engaged in their primary duties. What made this cross-training so essential for survival? Every man aboard was a soldier first and a specialist second. This cross-training was necessary because casualties were common and roles fluid. A waist gunner killed by fighter fire meant other crew members had to cover his position while managing their own responsibilities. An oxygen system failure in one compartment might force crew members to move to sections with functioning oxygen supplies. Battle damage could disable intercom systems, requiring hand signals or written notes to coordinate. The best crews trained together for months before combat, learning not just their own jobs but everyone else's, developing the versatility that meant the difference between mission completion and catastrophic failure. The missions to Schweinfurt in August had demonstrated the limits of defensive armament, but the raids didn't stop. Why did strategic bombing doctrine demand continued pressure despite such heavy losses? Strategic bombing doctrine demanded continued pressure regardless of loss rates. 8th Air Force planners believed that if they could destroy enough ball-bearing production capacity, the entire German war machine would grind to a halt. Tanks, aircraft, vehicles, everything depended on precision bearings. Schweinfurt produced nearly half of Germany's supply. Destroy Schweinfurt, and you crippled German industry for months, perhaps permanently. So, on October 14, 1943, they went back. 291 B-17s launched that morning, bound for Schweinfurt. The weather over England was clear. The Germans would have hours of warning as the formations assembled and headed east. There would be no surprise, no tactical advantage. The bombers would fly into the teeth of concentrated defenses in daylight, with every German fighter pilot in the west vectoring to intercept. What was the mood among the crews, knowing the grim odds? The crews knew the odds. At the mission briefing, when the curtain pulled back to reveal Schweinfurt as the target, a nervous laugh rippled through the room. Someone muttered, "Goodbye," loud enough to be heard. The comment drew chuckles, dark humor that masked genuine dread. They'd all studied the loss figures from the August raid. They knew what Schweinfurt meant. Colonel Elliot van der Vanter, addressing the 385th Bomb Group at Great Ashfield, kept his briefing matter of fact. "This is a tough job and I know you can do it. Good luck, good bombing and good hunting." The men filed out to their aircraft, knowing that statistically, 1 in 5 would not return. The first fighters appeared shortly after the bombers crossed the German frontier. The escort Thunderbolts, flying at the absolute limit of their range, turned back reluctantly, waggling their wings in farewell. The bombers continued alone. What ensued was an aerial battle of unprecedented ferocity. What followed was later described by official Air Force historians as unprecedented in magnitude, cleverness, and severity. The Luftwaffe had learned from August. This time, they coordinated their attacks with precision. Fighter formations positioned ahead of the bomber stream, allowing the fortresses to come to them rather than exhausting fuel in pursuit. The first assault wave consisted primarily of Messerschmitt Bf 109s, fast, nimble fighters optimized for high-altitude combat. Their mission was to engage and disrupt, breaking up the tight formation geometry that provided mutual defensive coverage. They dove from high altitude, executed slashing attacks with cannon and machine gun fire, then climbed away before the massed defensive fire could find them. What devastating new weapons did the second wave bring? The second wave came minutes later. Heavily armed Focke-Wulf FW-190s and twin-engine Messerschmitt Me 110s, bristling with cannons. These were the bomber killers designed specifically to destroy heavy aircraft. Some carried multiple 30mm cannons that could tear a bomber apart with a single burst. Others were equipped with 21 scimitar rockets, unguided missiles with 40 LB warheads launched from tubes beneath the wings. The rockets were inaccurate, but devastating. A direct hit would vaporize a bomber instantly. A near miss could inflict enough damage to force the aircraft out of formation, making it vulnerable to follow-up attacks. How did the B-17 gunners respond to this relentless assault? The defensive fire from the bomber formations was intense. Hundreds of .50 caliber guns tracked the incoming fighters, streams of tracers crisscrossing the sky in deadly patterns. German pilots described flying through the defensive fire as like flying through a thunderstorm made of steel. The air itself seemed solid with bullets. Some pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination, closing to point-blank range before firing, accepting hits to their aircraft in exchange for certain kills. Others made high-speed passes from outside optimal range, firing long bursts in hopes of lucky hits, breaking away as soon as the defensive fire grew too intense. The battle continued for hours as the formations pushed toward Schweinfurt. Bombers fell, some trailing fire, others breaking apart in mid-air, a few simply dropping out of formation with engines silent, gliding down toward German territory where survivors would become prisoners. Fighters fell too, spinning down in flames or tumbling end over end, wings torn off by exploding ammunition. The sky between the Dutch border and Schweinfurt became a vertical battlefield, littered with falling debris, burning aircraft, parachutes, and spent shell casings glinting in the autumn sun. What awaited them at the target? The bombers reached Schweinfurt shortly after 2 in the afternoon. Flak filled the sky, black clouds of exploding 88mm shells that left the air stinking of cordite. The bombardiers worked their sights, compensating for wind drift and altitude, releasing their loads over the target. Bombs tumbled down, spinning, accelerating, impacting the factories and rail yards in fountains of smoke and debris. Then the formations turned for home. The German fighters were waiting. They'd landed, refueled, rearmed, and positioned themselves along the withdrawal route. The exhausted bomber crews, low on ammunition, many aircraft already damaged, faced fresh attackers. The losses mounted. Radio discipline broke down as crews called out targets, warned of attacks, and screamed for help from fighters that weren't there. Some bomber formations fragmented entirely, individual aircraft attempting to make their own way home through hostile airspace. What was the final, devastating tally? 60 B-17s were shot down over Germany. 5 more crashed or crash-landed in England, 2 damaged to save. 12 additional aircraft were damaged beyond economical repair and written off. 17 were permanently lost, casualties inflicted on aircraft that flew subsequent missions before accumulating enough damage to be retired. The total losses exceeded 1/3 of the attacking force. 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters, a kill ratio of roughly 3 bombers for every 2 fighters, a favorable kill ratio from the German perspective, though the loss of experienced pilots hurt more than the loss of aircraft. Both sides claimed victory. The Americans had struck deep into Germany and hit their targets. The Germans had inflicted unsustainable losses that would force a pause in deep penetration daylight raids. Both sides were right, and both faced uncomfortable questions about their strategies going forward. What did October 14, 1943 become known as? October 14, 1943 became known as Black Thursday. It marked the end of unescorted deep penetration daylight bombing by the 8th Air Force. Strategic raids beyond fighter range were suspended indefinitely. The bombers would not return to Schweinfurt until February 1944. And when they did, they would be escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters equipped with drop tanks that extended their combat radius to cover targets throughout Germany. The pause in operations allowed both sides to reassess. For the Luftwaffe, Black Thursday seemed to validate their defensive strategy. The combined losses inflicted during the October raids, 120 bombers destroyed in 3 missions, suggested that sustained attrition could halt the American offensive. German propaganda celebrated the victory, declaring that the daylight bombers had been defeated. Luftwaffe commanders pushed for more resources to be allocated to homeland defense, arguing that the Western Front deserved priority over the Eastern Front's insatiable demand for aircraft and pilots. But the celebration was premature. Why was this tactical victory ultimately a strategic defeat? The Luftwaffe had won a tactical victory while losing the strategic war. Every German fighter defending the homeland was a fighter not available for ground support in Russia or the Mediterranean. Every pilot lost over Germany was an irreplaceable veteran whose experience couldn't be transmitted to undertrained replacements arriving from flight schools. And most critically, the production figures told a story that no amount of tactical success could overcome. In October 1943, American factories produced roughly 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s combined. German factories produced approximately 1,000 fighters of all types, including single-engine, twin-engine, night fighters, and ground attack aircraft. The Americans could replace their October losses in 3 weeks. The Germans needed a month to replace theirs, while simultaneously covering losses on other fronts, and the American production rate was increasing, while German production was constrained by raw material shortages, bombing damage, and labor shortages as millions of men were consumed by the Eastern Front. The ammunition production disparity was even more stark. American plants produced over 6 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during the war, roughly 200,000 rounds per day, averaged across the entire conflict. German production of 20mm cannon ammunition totaled approximately 400 million rounds for all calibers of aircraft cannon combined. The Americans produced more defensive ammunition for their bombers than the Germans produced offensive ammunition for their fighters. How did this industrial asymmetry dictate the war's outcome? The strategic implications were inescapable. Germany was fighting an attrition war it could not win. Every fighter lost, every pilot killed, every round of ammunition expended brought the Luftwaffe closer to collapse. The Americans could sustain losses that would have crippled any other air force because their industrial base was essentially unlimited and positioned beyond the reach of German retaliation. British factories were bombed but never shut down. American factories never faced enemy action at all. The production machines operated continuously, fed by resources from an entire continent, staffed by workers who never experienced shortages or bombardment. The B-17's 1350 caliber guns were a symbol of this industrial supremacy. Each gun represented dozens of precision components manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Each round of ammunition required brass, steel, powder, and primers, materials that Germany was increasingly unable to secure. The fact that American planners could contemplate arming a single bomber with 13 heavy machine guns and loading it with 7,500 rounds demonstrated a level of industrial excess that Germany simply could not match. What did German engineers discover when examining captured American equipment? German engineers examining captured American equipment during this period reported findings that were simultaneously impressive and demoralizing. The manufacturing quality was exceptional. Precision machining, standardized parts that were genuinely interchangeable, assembly techniques that prioritized speed without sacrificing reliability. The Americans had clearly spent years developing production systems optimized for mass manufacture. Every component showed evidence of design for manufacturing principles, simplified geometries, reduced part counts, clever uses of stamping and casting to replace machined components. The .50 caliber guns were exemplary in this regard, relatively simple designs that could be produced rapidly while maintaining the tight tolerances necessary for reliability. But it was the logistics that truly impressed German analysts. Captured B-17s contained maintenance logs and inspection, records that revealed American supply chains functioned with clockwork regularity. Spare parts arrived on schedule. Ammunition was never in short supply. Maintenance intervals were rigidly enforced. Aircraft that reached specified flight hours were pulled from service for depot-level overhaul regardless of their apparent condition. This was preventive maintenance elevated to doctrine, a luxury afforded only by abundant resources. How did this contrast with Germany's own struggles? German maintenance practices, by contrast, were increasingly dominated by crisis management. Aircraft flew well beyond their designed service lives because replacements weren't available. Maintenance was deferred until failure became imminent. Spare parts were cannibalized from damaged aircraft or improvised from whatever materials could be found. The Luftwaffe's technical capability hadn't diminished. Their engineers and mechanics remained among the best in the world, but they were forced to work with ever-shrinking resources while facing ever-increasing demands. The ammunition situation illustrated the disparity perfectly. 150 caliber rounds were everywhere in American supply chains, stockpiled at bases, loaded aboard ships, warehoused in depots across England. If a bomber group exhausted its allocation during intense combat, replacement ammunition arrived within days. German fighter groups, by contrast, faced chronic ammunition shortages by late 1943. Cannon rounds were strictly rationed. Pilots were ordered to fire only when hits were certain, to break off attacks rather than waste ammunition on low-probability shots. This conservation mindset directly contradicted the aggressive tactics needed to defeat bomber formations. A pilot trying to conserve ammunition was a pilot who couldn't effectively engage. How did fuel shortages further cripple the Luftwaffe? The fuel situation was equally constraining. Germany's synthetic fuel production, critical because Germany lacked natural petroleum reserves, was insufficient to meet military demands even before Allied bombing began targeting refineries. By 1943, fuel allocations for training were being cut to preserve supplies for combat operations. New pilots arrived at frontline units with perhaps 50 flight hours, a fraction of the training their opponents received. The Americans could afford to give their pilots hundreds of hours of flight time before combat deployment. German pilots learned on the job or died trying. The winter of 1943 passed with the 8th Air Force rebuilding strength and waiting for the arrival of long-range escort fighters. The bombers still flew, attacking targets within fighter range, hitting coastal installations, maintaining pressure, but the deep penetration raids that had characterized the Bloody Fall were suspended. Crews trained replacement personnel, aircraft were repaired and upgraded, and planners studied the lessons of Schweinfurt. How did the Germans utilize this respite? The Germans used the respite to strengthen their defenses. More fighters were pulled back from other fronts. Anti-aircraft batteries proliferated around key industrial targets. Luftwaffe tactics became increasingly sophisticated, with ground controllers vectoring fighters to optimal intercept points using radar data and observer reports. The defense in depth was formidable. Early warning from occupied territories, fighter intercepts during approach, concentrated flak over targets, and renewed fighter attacks during withdrawal. Every element was designed to maximize bomber attrition while minimizing German losses. But the respite was temporary. What fundamental change swept the skies in February 1944? In February 1944, the nature of the air war over Europe changed fundamentally with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in substantial numbers. The Mustang was revolutionary not because of superior performance, though it was fast and maneuverable, but because of range. Equipped with drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a combat radius that covered virtually every strategic target in the Reich. The era of unescorted daylight raids was over. The era of escorted raids was beginning, and with it came the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe fighter force. How did these new tactics shift the balance of power? The new tactics were straightforward. Escort fighters didn't simply protect bombers, they actively hunted German fighters, flying ahead of the bomber stream to clear the airspace, engaging intercept formations before they could reach the bombers, pursuing damaged German aircraft back to their airfields. The Mustang pilots had orders to be aggressive, to take the fight to the Luftwaffe, to destroy German fighters in the air or on the ground. The strategic goal had evolved from merely bombing targets to achieving air supremacy through attrition of the enemy fighter force. The B-17 formation still relied on their defensive armament. The 1350 caliber guns remained crucial for self-protection, but now they operated within an envelope of fighter cover that fundamentally altered the tactical equation. German fighters attempting to attack bombers had to first fight through American escort fighters, then face the mass defensive fire of the formations, then escape through the escorts again. The mathematics of attrition now heavily favored the attackers. How did this impact German pilots and equipment? The Luftwaffe loss rates climbed steeply through spring 1944. Experienced pilots, the veterans who'd survived years of combat, fell at an accelerating pace. Their replacements arrived with minimal training, inadequate flight hours, and virtually no gunnery practice. A German pilot in early 1944 might have 30 hours of flight time before his first combat mission. His American opponent likely had 300 hours or more. The skill disparity was crushing. German pilots who survived their first 10 missions had reasonable chances of continued survival, but most didn't survive their first 10 missions. The quality of German equipment also began to deteriorate. Shortages of critical materials forced substitutions, aluminum components replaced with steel, increasing weight and reducing performance. Manufacturing shortcuts became common as production quotas took priority over quality control. Aircraft that would have been rejected in 1942 now entered service with known defects that crews were expected to manage. The reliability that had characterized German engineering declined as the industrial base crumbled under sustained bombing and resource depletion. How did the American supply of .50 caliber ammunition exemplify this growing disparity? The .50 caliber ammunition continued flowing to American bomber units in quantities that seemed limitless. Mission planning assumed unlimited ammunition availability. If a group exhausted its stocks during intense combat, replacement supplies arrived before the next mission. The supply system was so robust that waste became acceptable. Partially expended ammunition belts were often discarded rather than reloaded to avoid the risk of feeding malfunctions. Fresh ammunition for every mission was standard practice. By spring 1944, the defensive armament of the B-17 had reached its final evolution. The B-17G model, with its 13 guns and refined ammunition distribution, represented the culmination of 3 years of combat experience and iterative improvement. The placement of weapons covered virtually every approach vector. The ammunition types were optimized for anti-fighter work, predominantly armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could penetrate fighter armor and ignite fuel with a single hit. The computing sights in powered turrets gave even average gunners accuracy that would have been impossible with manual aiming. And most importantly, the crews were veterans who understood their weapons and aircraft intimately. How had the B-17 gunner evolved into a formidable combatant? The typical B-17 gunner in mid-1944 had characteristics that would have seemed impossible in 1942. He'd flown 20 or more missions, survived dozens of fighter attacks, developed instincts that bordered on precognitive. He could identify German fighter types at maximum visual range. He knew which attacks were serious and which were feints. He understood ammunition conservation, when to fire and when to hold without being told. He maintained his weapon to standards that exceeded manual specifications because he understood that reliability meant survival. These weren't conscripts learning on the job, they were combat veterans with skills honed through repetition under mortal pressure. The German pilots faced increasingly impossible odds. Attacking a bomber formation now meant running a gauntlet of escort fighters, then facing the concentrated fire of hundreds of .50 caliber guns manned by experienced gunners. Then escaping through the escorts again, all while flying aircraft that might be suffering mechanical problems, burning fuel that was adulterated with synthetic additives that reduced engine performance, armed with ammunition that had been stored improperly and might malfunction. The courage required was extraordinary. The survival rates were abysmal. Yet despite these conditions, some German pilots achieved staggering victory totals. What did the overall statistics reveal? Some German pilots accumulated staggering victory totals despite these conditions. Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer destroyed 121 Allied aircraft, mostly heavy bombers, making him the highest-scoring night fighter ace in history. Major Wilhelm Moritz of Jagdgeschwader 3 destroyed 33 B-17 bombers in daylight combat. These were exceptional pilots flying with exceptional skill and determination, but they were exceptions. The average German fighter pilot in late 1944 survived perhaps a dozen missions before being killed, wounded, or captured. The ammunition expenditure during major raids reached astronomical figures. On a typical mission involving 600 bombers, not unusual by mid-1944, the formations carried approximately 4.5 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition aloft. If even 20% of that ammunition was fired during the mission, a conservative estimate for contested raids, that represented 900,000 rounds expended in a few hours. The Germans couldn't produce that much fighter ammunition in a week for their entire air force. The physical evidence of this disparity littered the battlefields. Crashed B-17s in Germany were often found with substantial ammunition remaining, evidence that the defensive fire had been sufficient to deter attacks or drive off fighters before ammunition exhaustion. Crashed German fighters, by contrast, were almost always found with empty ammunition bays. The pilots had fired everything they had, exhausted their offensive capability, and still failed to destroy enough bombers to make the attacks worthwhile. How did this imbalance lead to strategic air supremacy? By autumn 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved air supremacy over Germany. The Luftwaffe still existed, still flew missions, still occasionally inflicted significant losses, but it could no longer contest American daylight operations with any reasonable expectation of success. Bomber formations flew to targets throughout Germany, dropped their loads, and returned home with loss rates that had declined to 1 or 2%, sustainable indefinitely given American production capacity. The 50 caliber guns were no longer the primary defense. Escort fighters bore that burden. But the guns remained essential for those moments when fighters penetrated the escort screen, when mechanical failures forced bombers to drop behind their formations, when wounded aircraft limped home alone through hostile airspace. The guns were the last resort, the final protection, and they were very good at their job. What did the statistics from the war's final months reveal about this shift in power? The statistics from late war missions told the story. In December 1944, the 8th Air Force flew over 24,000 sorties and lost 197 heavy bombers, a loss rate under 1%. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lost roughly 300 fighters in aerial combat over the Reich during the same period. The attrition ratio had completely reversed from the dark days of 1943. The Germans were now losing aircraft and pilots at rates they could not possibly sustain. The ammunition production figures for 1944 illustrated American industrial dominance. US plants produced over 2 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition that year alone, more than the cumulative total of all German cannon ammunition produced during the entire war. The monthly production rate exceeded 150 million rounds. That single month's production represented more ammunition than most air forces fired during the entire conflict. It was industrial capacity weaponized, turned into a strategic advantage that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. What was the German intelligence assessment of this overwhelming industrial might? German intelligence officers analyzing captured American equipment in late 1944 wrote reports that bordered on despair. The manufacturing quality remained exceptional. The supply systems functioned flawlessly. The ammunition was perfect, every round to specification. No variations, no defects. They compared this to their own situation: factories bombed weekly, rail networks disrupted, raw materials in chronic shortage, workers exhausted or conscripted, quality controls sacrificed for quantity. The contrast was absolute. One particularly detailed German intelligence report from November 1944 examined a crashed B-17 and catalogued its ammunition load with precision. The aircraft carried 7,400 rounds distributed across its 13 gun positions, slightly below full capacity, suggesting some positions had fired during combat. The ammunition dated from September 1944, meaning it was less than 2 months old when loaded. German analysts noted that their own fighter units were sometimes forced to use ammunition manufactured in 1941 or 1942 because newer production couldn't meet demand. 4-year-old ammunition suffered degradation, powder deterioration, primer reliability issues, case corrosion that reduced effectiveness. The Americans were using ammunition manufactured weeks or months before loading. The report's conclusion was blunt: the enemy's industrial capacity makes prolonged resistance impossible. Every aspect of their military supply demonstrates abundance that we cannot match. The ammunition alone represents production capacity exceeding our total small arms and cannon ammunition combined. This disparity will only increase as their production expands and ours contracts under bombardment. How did this imbalance culminate in the war's final days? By early 1945, the air war over Germany had become a massacre. The Luftwaffe threw what remained of its fighter force into desperate defensive battles, accepting catastrophic losses in attempts to disrupt individual raids. They achieved tactical successes, single missions that saw dozens of bombers destroyed, but these victories were Pyrrhic. The Americans replaced losses within days. The Germans couldn't replace theirs at all. The 50 caliber guns continued doing their job. Gunners tracked targets, fired controlled bursts, watched fighters break away, trailing smoke or flames. The weapons functioned with the same reliability in the war's final months as they had in 1942. The ammunition feeding systems never failed, the barrels never burst, the mechanisms never ceased. It was a testament to engineering excellence and manufacturing precision that would become legendary in military circles. The last strategic bombing missions of the European War flew in April 1945 as Allied ground forces closed on Berlin from east and west. The bombers still carried their 13 guns, still loaded 7,500 rounds, and still maintained formation discipline. But the German fighter opposition had essentially collapsed. Most missions encountered no airborne resistance at all. The Luftwaffe's remaining fighters were grounded by fuel shortages or destroyed on their airfields by marauding Allied fighters. The crews that had fought through the bloody fall of 1943, that had pressed attacks through walls of defensive fire during 1944, were dead or captured or had retreated to training roles far from the front lines. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. What was the ultimate cost and outcome of this air campaign? The strategic bombing campaign ended with it. Final accounting showed the 8th Air Force had lost nearly 5,000 heavy bombers in combat, the majority B-17s. Over 35,000 aircrew were killed in action. The casualty rate among bomber crews exceeded 70% when accounting for killed, wounded, and captured. It was among the highest casualty rates of any American combat unit in any theater. But the campaign achieved its objectives. German industrial capacity was systematically destroyed. Transportation networks were shattered, fuel production collapsed. The Wehrmacht in the field faced chronic shortages of everything from ammunition to spare parts because the factories and logistics that supported them had been reduced to rubble. The strategic bombing offensive, combined with Soviet offensives in the east and Allied advances in the west, made German defeat inevitable. How did the 50 caliber machine gun itself endure beyond the war? The 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun that had armed those bombers continued in service long after the war ended. It remains in American military inventory today, 80 years after its combat debut, largely unchanged from the World War II configuration. It is the longest-serving small arm in American military history. The reasons for this longevity trace directly to its World War II performance. Absolute reliability, devastating effectiveness, and mechanical simplicity that allows operation under extreme conditions. The ammunition likewise remained standard for decades. The 50 caliber BMG cartridge armed everything from fighter aircraft to armored vehicles to heavy machine gun positions. Modern versions use improved propellants and projectiles, but the basic design, that same cartridge German engineers examined in 1943, remains current. No replacement has proven sufficiently superior to justify the enormous cost of transitioning to a new standard. What broader philosophy of warfare did the B-17's defensive armament represent? The legacy of the B-17's defensive armament extends beyond the specific weapons and ammunition. It represents a philosophy of warfare that prioritized industrial capacity and technological superiority over tactical elegance. The Americans accepted that their bombers would face determined opposition and designed systems to overwhelm that opposition through sheer volume. 13 guns was excessive by any reasonable standard. Most bombers from other nations carried half that number or less. But the Americans could afford 13 guns per aircraft, could afford 7,500 rounds per mission, could afford to replace lost aircraft within weeks. That excess was the point. It demonstrated to friend and enemy alike that American industrial capacity was functionally unlimited. German officers examining the wreckage of B-17s during the war understood this implicitly. The ammunition containers weren't simply metal boxes holding cartridges. They were symbols of an industrial machine that operated beyond German comprehension. Factories producing billions of rounds annually, supply chains delivering those rounds to forward bases with clockwork precision, logistics networks ensuring that ammunition was never in short supply, regardless of expenditure rates. Every round represented resources, brass, steel, powder, primers, that Germany increasingly lacked. Every gun represented manufacturing capacity that Germany couldn't match even in peacetime, much less while being systematically bombed. How did the B-17 campaign shape future air warfare doctrine? The tactical lessons learned during the B-17 campaign influenced aerial warfare doctrine for generations. The importance of fighter escort, The limitations of defensive armament alone, the need for air supremacy before strategic bombing could succeed. These became foundational principles. Modern air forces don't attempt unescorted deep penetration bombing precisely because the World War II experience demonstrated its unsustainability against determined opposition. The bombers of 1943 proved that even exceptional defensive firepower couldn't compensate for lack of fighter cover. But within the constraints of their operational environment, the 50 caliber guns performed magnificently. They forced German fighters to adopt increasingly dangerous tactics. They inflicted steady attrition on the Luftwaffe fighter force. They gave bomber crews a fighting chance when separated from their formations. They allowed damaged aircraft to defend themselves during lonely flights home through hostile territory. The guns didn't win the air war. Fighter escorts and overwhelming numerical superiority won the air war, but they kept American losses manageable during the critical period before escorts arrived, and they remained effective throughout the conflict. What was the human cost behind these powerful defenses? The human cost of manning those guns deserves remembrance. Gunners stood at their positions for hours in sub-zero temperatures at altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe unassisted. They watched friends die in adjacent aircraft. They faced fighters attacking at 600 mph or closure rates with seconds to react. They operated machinery that could jam, malfunction, or overheat at critical moments. They did this mission after mission, knowing that statistically their chances of completing a 25-mission tour approached 50-50 at best during the dark months of 1943 and early 1944. Some gunners achieved ace status, 5 or more confirmed aerial victories, though their achievements were rarely celebrated outside their own units. Staff Sergeant Michael Barr of the 91st Bomb Group was credited with 17 confirmed kills, making him one of the highest-scoring non-pilot aces of the war. Technical Sergeant Arthur Benno destroyed 12 German fighters. These men developed gunnery skills that bordered on supernatural, the ability to lead targets instinctively, to track erratically maneuvering fighters, to fire the precise burst at the precise moment that meant the difference between a miss and a kill. Most gunners never achieved ace status. Most never knew with certainty whether their fire destroyed, damaged, or simply scared off attacking fighters. Combat occurred too fast for confirmation. Multiple gunners engaged single targets. Fighters broke away trailing smoke that might indicate fatal damage or might be temporary engine problems. The chaos of aerial combat made accurate assessment nearly impossible. But the cumulative effect of thousands of gunners firing millions of rounds created an environment where attacking bomber formations was extraordinarily dangerous for German pilots. And that deterrent effect was perhaps more valuable than confirmed kills. What profound lesson did the 50 caliber's story ultimately teach? The story of the 50 caliber ammunition and the 13-gun armament of the B-17 is ultimately a story about industrial warfare and the mathematics of attrition. The Germans who examined captured ammunition in 1943 understood immediately what they faced: not a superior weapon system in isolation, but a superior industrial system that could produce and sustain weapon systems at scales that made tactical innovation increasingly irrelevant. No amount of pilot skill could overcome ammunition shortages. No tactical brilliance could compensate for being outnumbered. 3-1 or 5-1 or 10-1. No courage could substitute for fuel or spare parts or replacement aircraft. The 13 guns represented American abundance applied to warfare. They were excessive, redundant, over-engineered, and perfectly suited to their purpose. They kept German fighters at bay through volume of fire rather than precision. They demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own, and they remain emblematic of the fundamental truth that decided the Second World War. Industrial capacity matters more than tactical excellence when fighting a prolonged conflict of attrition. The Germans learned this lesson at terrible cost. Their pilots were among the finest in the world, their aircraft often technically superior, their tactics innovative and aggressive, but they were fighting an enemy who could afford to lose 10 aircraft for every one German loss and still emerge victorious, because those 10 aircraft would be replaced before the next mission, while the German loss would never be replaced at all. The 50 caliber rounds that German engineers measured and analyzed weren't merely ammunition. They were harbingers of defeat, physical evidence that Germany had entered a war it could not win because it could not match the industrial output of its enemies. In the end, the question wasn't whether German pilots were brave enough or skilled enough or determined enough to stop the American daylight bombing offensive. They were all those things and more. The question was whether courage and skill could overcome material disadvantage, measured in orders of magnitude. The answer, written in the wreckage of thousands of aircraft scattered across Europe, was no. Industrial capacity decided the war. The 50 caliber guns were simply one manifestation of that capacity, reliable, devastating, and produced in such quantities that waste became acceptable and excess became doctrine. The B-17 crews who manned those guns never fully appreciated the broader implications. They focused on immediate concerns, staying alive, completing missions, getting home to bases in England. But their collective effort, sustained over 3 years of brutal aerial combat, helped destroy the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force and cleared the skies over Europe for the invasion that would liberate the continent. The guns they fired, the ammunition they expended, the formations they maintained, all were components of a military machine that ultimately proved unstoppable. Not because of brilliance, but because of scale. That scale was what German officers understood when they examined captured 50 caliber ammunition in 1943. They weren't looking at particularly advanced technology. The Browning M2 was fundamentally a World War I design, refined through decades of incremental improvement. They were looking at technology deployed at scales their own industrial base could never hope to match. Every round represented a small piece of an industrial capacity so vast that individual losses barely registered. That capacity, more than any tactical innovation, more than any technological advantage, more than courage or skill, decided the outcome of the air war over Europe. The 50 caliber guns did their job, the crews who manned them did their job, the supply chains that fed them did their job. Together, they demonstrated that in modern warfare, logistical excellence and industrial capacity matter more than martial virtue. It's an uncomfortable truth, one that diminishes the importance of individual courage and skill. But it's the truth that emerged from the skies over Europe between 1942 and 1945, written in smoke trails and falling aircraft, and the steady hammer of 13 machine guns per bomber. Mission after mission, until the enemy could no longer resist.